Dombuluvinaka and Maloni. My name is Emele Ugavule, and before we begin this Talanoa, I would like to first pay and extend my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways on which this Talanoa is being recorded. I want to pay my respects to the Wajak Noongar of the Bibbulmun Nation, and acknowledge them as the traditional and ongoing custodians of the lands and waterways, skies on which I work, live, and create on. And I want to extend my deepest gratitude to the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art for facilitating this virtual Talanoa between myself and Salote. For those of you who don't know me, my maternal lineage links back to Nukunonu in Tokelauan, and my paternal lineage links back to Teumba in Fiji. And today I have the privilege of sharing virtual space with Salote Tawale. Salote is a Fijian-Australian artist from Brewa and Novo, and she is based on Gadigal lands. So welcome, Salote. I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Emele. Good to see you today. I just also want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And just I'm really grateful to be here. And I'm a video installation artist. I'm from Rewa Northor and also settler colonial country Victoria. And that's sort of the starting point for my practice. I always come from that perspective of being of mixed heritage, of being from Fiji, being living in Australia, and vice versa, which maybe you'll understand as well. When you're in one place, it always kind of, you embody and represent the other place that you're not in at the time.
Yeah, Vanaka Salote. So today's discussion, as you can see behind me, is actually inside the exhibition room of Salote's latest solo exhibition titled I Don't See Colour, and that's currently, as I said earlier, on display at PICA. And this work is multi-textured and multi-layered in the way that the room is presented, but also like the forms of the works that are presented and the discussions that are happening within. And Salote, I'd love for us to like begin by just talking about the genesis of this work and this room that you've created, and where that all began.
Well, I guess the hint is in the title for me. Quite often titles relate to the beginnings of a project. I Don't See Colour comes from a statement made to me by a young guy at a party while I was in London. And he kind of made this statement about not seeing colour with regards to race. And it kind of stopped me for a moment, because I think I know that people think that, but he was somebody proudly saying out loud that they were not encumbered by, seeing race at all. And my response to him was, how can you not? Even though I knew that he wouldn't have to, he was a white male. And we just then started this sort of discussion about what it means to not see colour. And actually for me, that the start of that discussion really impacted on all of the research that I was doing into archives. There was a lot of discussion while I was away about the environment and climate change. And I just thought about how a statement like that might seem positive, but it throws away legacies, our own privileges that we sit in, but also that, we all sit together with different legacies. And so that was like the beginning for me. And what I really wanted to do was create a work that traveled with me as I thought out this statement. So that's why there's so many things in the show. There's hanging paintings, there's the background that you're sitting in front of right now, there's the Mbolobola, which is sort of, we can talk about a little bit later, but all these little elements that relate to my own legacies, but also what a statement like I don't see colour really means.
Naka Salote, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. It's really, I think, what stuck for me out of what you shared is just like how easily it feels like in 2021 in particular, like these statements, these like really bold statements in regards to race relations, it kind of like become hashtags or become like really common to hear in conversations without people really unpacking what it actually means. And you and I have spoken about this before, like, I guess, like, what does it look like for us to be in conversation with our legacy, right? Like the legacy that we inherit, but also the responsibility of our legacy to those who come after us, without erasing or disappearing, as Alok would say, the importance of those nuances. And I feel like you really, in a really unique way, bring those conversations into this space at PICA, which in the short time that I've known PICA or been in relationship with PICA, I have never seen work by a solo work by a Fijian artist. So for me, it's like quite a big deal to see your work here. But then also on top of that, what the types of works are, like these beautiful textures behind me, of like that for me like emulate the woven like imbe textures, right? And then, like as you said, you have the mbola, and then you have like these self-portraiture that are like hanging in the space. Like so much of this is like unique to you, also to us as Fijians, right? And when Fijians enter this space, they immediately recognize themselves or parts of themselves in this space. And I was just wondering, like, if you wanted to speak on like what it means for you to be here in this space. I mean, obviously you're in Gadigal country right now, but to have of your work, you know, here in this institution, and the types of the work, you know, the structure, the architecture of the mbola and the imbe patterns around. What's that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's like they all are very kind of, for me, thoughtful as to what my experience of the institution is and what other people's experience might be. Like there's a whole lot of, like, everything is charged with ideas and histories and like personal nostalgias. Like the patterns around you, they do remind, even looking at them a little bit, they remind me of the smell of the mat when you sit on it, and there's a real like a comfort to that for me. But then for the person who hasn't had that experience, it's, you know, a more textural response. You know, the textures are there and they envelope the whole area. They take over the architecture. There's windows on the left-hand side of the gallery as you walk in, and I'm hoping the patterning kind of makes them disappear and set back into the pattern, so you can't see them, because for the moment that you're in that exhibition, you're in that textural experience, and you're kind of in my memory. You're not going to necessarily have the same memory as me, but you're having a sort of an experience. But if you're a Fijian person, my hope is that you will see those kind of remnants that remind you of home. The mbola is like, you know, that's a temporary room, and most Fijians have had the experience of any kind of big family event or any event that you go to where, you know, one of those are set up for people to rest and relax in, but also as temporary kitchens, you know, and a lot of, it's a very communal space, and a lot of, like, I've learned a lot in rooms like that from my aunties. I've slept in them, you know, had a good cup of tea, you know, sitting in there, listening, just even listening to voices. And so, you know, I kind of am trying to balance out these really personal moments that are quite abstracted to be sometimes new experiences, and sometimes like just a reminder for people who've had those experiences before.
Yeah, it's really amazing, just like what you were saying about like the layering of the senses, right? And how I love what you said about how, like, for someone like yourself, you think about like the smell of the pandanus with the woven mat, but for somebody else who's not familiar with that, like it's just about like the relationship with the patterns, right, and the textures, like and I think for myself, like I definitely always wonder what do I bring into this space to support like building that environment, and how far can that go? Like, you know, in terms of my practice working in performing arts, whenever I bring, you know, Fijian practices or like concepts into the performance space, I'm always wondering like, how much do I need to bring in to support that for audiences who have no context for Fiji, or no context for Fiji beyond like this like really beautiful tourist destination. And how much of that is like not my responsibility and just to like serve what Fijian community or like people who are attending the performance, what serves them in that space and supports them in that space. And it's a really hard thing to negotiate, like, because obviously as an artist, you have your intention in the work that you create and the way that you hope that people will read it. But at the end of the day, like you can't control that. You can't control those variables. And
yeah, because people come to things, people come to things with their own, fits into the concept. People come to the space with their own legacies and their own stories. Like for me, they're like, you know, there's different audiences to this. And, you know, you told me a story of like the those Fijian guys coming and sitting in them bola bola. And because I expect coming into a gallery, if you don't normally go into galleries, can be a daunting process, but to then go and sit down in something that reminds you of a place and is comforting, that for me, I was like so happy when you told me about that. But then there's also people posting pictures of the colors and the textures. You know, I don't think it's my responsibility to tell people the most intimate details of my story. It's the abstract things that lead to this idea of other stories and other legacies. That's the on the very surface of that's for me enough of an experience for somebody else to have, and that for them to start a thinking process about it.
That's so beautiful. And I wish that there was more of that. Like, I wish that there was more of that, because you're right. Like, I guess, I mean, there is no right or wrong, but just like thinking of like the way that you create space as like a conduit for other people to then begin exploring or feeling the call to share their story or tap into their story. It's like, it is definitely what you're doing. And what happened with those elders when they came in, you know, like they very rarely come to the city. The city is like not a space for them as elders, but also it's like very rare to see like Fijian community en masse in this, like in the cultural center. So there's that. And then also like being in an art center is another thing. And so like to see that piece of home and see them just like go and sit down and just like observe and feel the textures, particularly when we're so separated from home right now and we don't know when we'll be able to go home. That really, you know, was the beginning of an opportunity for them to start sharing stories, which is what happened. We went downstairs and we had the cultural exchange between my elder and our elders, and there was a sebu, and from that they were drinking angona and everybody started having conversations and talking about home in a really, really beautiful way.
Amazing.
And that's what I hope for these spaces, right? I mean, and I wish, as I said, that we had more of that, just like more of the leaning into, I don't know, being portals rather than necessarily having to have like the answer for something or like the outcome all figured out, predetermined.
I think, well, I mean, the video inside the Bola Bola is a poem that is totally written from just my contemporary anxieties, I think. And I'm just thinking about that in relation to what you just said. And there are no answers in that. Like, it is open-ended, because I feel like life at the moment is open-ended. And that's not just at the moment, it's always that way, but we have these constructs around us to make us feel, it makes us feel safer. And I think maybe not the same for Western Australia right now, but you know, in the east, especially in New South Wales, we've got such high numbers, and those structures have fallen away a bit more. We're like more prone to thinking more deeply about what makes us anxious in the world right now, and yeah, just not looking for answers as much as maybe contemplating the things that I have right now.
Yeah, I think that it's really, first of all, that work is really beautiful, and just those images of like, you know, matched with those images of you like swimming underwater is so visceral. But yeah, the way that I guess we've been forced to reimagine certainty, or at least our relationship with certainty, is definitely, I think, at the top of my mind, but also I can definitely feel that coming through, and something that we've definitely had discussions about, like how do we move towards something, or feel like we can measure movement, or measure like productivity, or you know, just like doing something. How can we measure that we've done something that's successful, or it's moving towards a goal, if we don't know what the goal is, or the boundaries for the goal keep moving, right? And like going forward and going, and also like I think realizing that, you know, for me being here in WA, my perception of being in a pandemic is so different to what yours is, and it's so different to like what is happening in Fiji and what people are experiencing as a pandemic.
Oh yeah.
And like just leaning into that multiplicity, it's like, it's so, I think prior to the pandemic, it's so easy to like just forget that we live in different worlds, and like that the like assume that the quality of life and access to things like internet and things like food and water were the same, and healthcare were the same, even though you know that intellectually it's not. But like to physically experience it in a place like a colony like Australia is another thing. So to see that through the like divide of like the way that our different states and our countries are dealing with it, and how we have to manage that for ourselves on a daily basis, but also that for our kin overseas, and manage that, like how we kind of like help them get through that without what we're doing, is kind of like the state of affairs, really.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that we're not just helping them get through that, they're helping us as well.
Yeah.
Like there's like all of the ways that you think that we could help here, like over there, I don't know, like through financial support and things like, you know, vaccination, and people being aware of, like, you know, because there's a lot of videos out there on Facebook that counter this ideas of vaccination and stuff like that. But also just the like seeing all the pictures from home, all the videos. I really love that kind of anytime someone posts something from my village, or anything that's posted that's about a Fijian meal, like pana keki. I saw one the other day. I was like, delicious. But yeah, like I think it is this time of like needing to, I guess, like, I don't know, be more nostalgic or something. So I think that kind of fits into what I'm doing here as well, and that we're all we're separated, but then we're all together, and it's just like, I know it's probably different to pandemics before, in that, you know, we're not writing letters, we're being able to talk to each other right away, and you know, that kind of thing.
Really hyper connected. And so the way that we're like memorializing as we're experiencing is totally different, right? and because we're responding to everything in real time. And so like we don't necessarily, I don't know if luxury is the right word, but maybe in a prior pandemic, because of the separation of time, distance, there wasn't that hyperconnectivity. People had more time to process the grief and the nostalgia and all of the feelings and emotions that people are feeling. But because we are seeing everything in real time, we're like experiencing that all at once, and sometimes it's overwhelming and sometimes it's exactly what we need in terms of being hyperconnected.
Like a constant, it's like a constant worry or something, which is actually something that has been talked about for a while, I guess. The moment technology is introduced into the world already, life is changing. But I think the point maybe too that I was trying to make there, especially with those large hanging paintings, is that we are all, although we have all these separate legacies and stories, they're all sitting in the same places. And that's what we have to deal with. There isn't one perspective. There's a number of histories running at the same time, all interconnected, which actually, I guess, Facebook does right now immediately. But like we're talking about in the past, maybe what is also happening there is like, to look at those connections. There's more looking into archive material, listening to family stories, as opposed to, it feels like it's all on Facebook for me at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not on Facebook currently, but when I used to be on Facebook.
Oh yeah, I forgot that I'm speaking to a non-Facebook user.
I am a former user, so I do have some memory of what it's like on there. And I used to, as you were saying before, about like the pictures of people's food, I used to be part of these groups that were like Fiji food, and like I remember like Fiji barter for better Fiji, when like people kind of started up the like Vesa bartering trades when the pandemic hit, and like Fiji home gardens, like all of those spaces were like for me into life back home, and seeing the way that that sense of community was built and cultivated and maintained. It was really, really beautiful, and definitely something that I don't take for granted at all now that I'm all the way over here and can't see that, can't be eating dalo and cassava and ikawakalolo all the time, like
the
same way.
I think because I can't do those things, things like spatial awareness in shows, like sometimes you relate to the Fijian urban garden, like the way that plants and that's how I kind of work out spaces. Or maybe it's like a photo that I've seen from home, and I think, okay, well, when I'm going to place these paintings and stuff, I'm going to place them like they would be just before the photo was taken. Or like using food, like using the mbola as a something nostalgic, but also something you can re-experience in the exhibition. Quite often I like to do something with food in that same way. I mean, how much would you give for a bite of some palasami right now, or and a piece of dalo? Magic.
That stuff is
some ota.
So expensive in Western Australia now. Like it's like
it travels so far.
Yeah, it travels far. It's a real delicacy trying to get your hands on that. Anything like yangona, dalo, cassava, all of it, which really, and there's like this really big, I love it. It's not a black market, but there are feeding pipelines across the Pacific community, in the way that people are like, you go to the Tongans for yangona, like the way that people have kind of like banded together, as you say, like to create these stories of accessing what would be home for us, or how we kind of like connect back to home, is really special. And I wanted to ask you, because this body of work has a lineage connected to your time at the Fiji National Archives, and just like looking through colonial records, like as we're kind of like talking about memory and
Mm.
what that's like. How is like, from my experience going to, I've only been to the National Archives once, and I've been to Fiji Museum a couple of times, and spending time with those, you know, with paper as like the records of memory. I went through this process of like taking these like colonial records and then going back to my family members and matching them against like the oral testimony of and memory of family members, and seeing where there was alignment and where there was like two very different truths or perspectives of the same event. And I was wondering, like, in your journey through going through these archives, did you have any experiences like that that were maybe surprising or unexpected?
Absolutely. Firstly, I'd say that my archive research of objects and paper have gone from Fiji to Cambridge to, you know, Key Branley in Paris. But the most exciting thing, I mean, I've seen lots of exciting things in archives, was one of like a family story that of one of the last acts of cannibalism. It exists as in the Fiji Museum as a like a little, what do you call those things? You know, it's a little display. And you know, I was with my family and we were just recording family histories, and we started to record people's memories and knowledges of this event. And one of my uncle, who sadly had just passed away before I got there, and my cousin, they had gone on a pilgrimage to follow through this storyline, without getting into the storyline because we could be here for hours. And so everyone's sharing it, and you know, we're all learning new things, just because it turns out, you know, everybody's holding little bits of knowledge from this story and how it relates to our family members and extended family members. And so we hear this story of this act of bravery of our my great-great-great-great-grandfather, who steps in front of a party that have surprised a missionary party going through the interior, and he gets killed. And that really makes sense in relation to our family and, you know, our job within villages and the area of Northor. And so hearing this oral history, and it comes from them doing this pilgrimage, family stories, and then getting records from the villages along the way, and then going to the archives to read like a Wesleyan missionary version, which the story changes around, and you know, the reverend who's leading the party is the hero. And it really made me think about how archive stories, regardless of whether they're in an official archive or in a family, they, like, you know, have, I guess, equal importance. They're not, one is not necessarily more true than the other, though in this case I would accept my family's recollection, just because it comes from a lot more sources, you know, and so therefore it's probably just a little bit more truer to me than if we take Western ideas of on how you value research, than this kind of Wesleyan missionary recount of the story. I love it when people tell me that they've had this experience like you're talking about, where you're like looking at these accounts and you get so excited, especially if there's a photograph. How excited do you get if there's a photograph? I
can't even explain like how happy I get when I find a photograph. I started that research journey of going through the archives because an uncle of mine had told me a story about one of our ancestors, and how that, like from the Mossy, and how that led our migration, our family, to migrate down to down across the Ngavul River and to the banks of the Umba. And for some reason, I was like burned in my memory. So I was like, I have to find a photograph of this ancestor. Like, I was just determined. And I haven't found the photograph yet, but along the way of like trying to find an image of this ancestor, I found all of these stories in different parts of the archives, in different family members, and just that process of sitting down right? And just like spending time with people. And as you said, like hearing the different recounts or different versions that all kind of line up anyway, that people have of the same story is like such a privilege to sit in, and it's so exciting to like be part of that memory.
Yeah. I think my whole family, the day that we sat down to record this story, was none of us expected it. It was just a way to ask questions, was to record this story, but everybody learnt so much that day. But you know, when you mentioned Dilmba, I just remember like sometimes we would go out there with our family and friends for a swim down at the beach. So when you mentioned it, I was like, oh yeah, I know where that is.
Have a little picnic area. There's beautiful coastal area there, but yeah, it's I miss it. But it's amazing. I think just like even thinking of like the stories of migration, like how we end up where we end up, and for me, that's been a really strong through line in terms of our, definitely my family, like my Fijian family, knowing that me looking for that one ancestor took me back to Namosi, which was like where we were originally from, which then took me back to like our migration story from Ra all the way over to Namosi, and like what our lineage is in terms of migration to Fiji. And I know that from my Tokelauan side, it's exactly the same. Like it's never just like this story in isolation of us being like in one place at one time, you know, like I have, for multiple reasons, ancestors and family and kin like all over the ocean. And like how we, as we kind of were talking about before, lean into that, this idea of like nothing being static and nothing being certain is not, it's not a new thing, right? It's actually become from a legacy of people who were, you know, explorers and who were inventors and who took those chances and changed things as they needed to adapt to their new environments or to culture shifting, you know, like technology shifting and dealing with
we traveled the oceans before, you know, that was before recorded time. We traveled from, you know, the African continent to the Pacific Islands. You know, there's a lot of those kind of, you know, we have this history of being immigrants, I guess, or migrating across, and culture changing and shifting. And, you know, I think they're actually really common stories that are not just Pacific Islander stories. I think most Australians, even like a, you know, a settler colonial story is a migration story. It's just got a different spin on it that needs a bit of reworking. When I say bit, I mean quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I think about like the time to put it like the things I think about are like how without migration, like food in Australia would be so boring. Like if it was just up to like the British colonies just like deciding what we all ate. And, you know, maybe there's other ways to talk about that, because I also think that probably pre that, Indigenous people in Australia, like Fijians, you know, there was probably just such delicious like culinary events happening, smoked eel, you know, so many kind of things that get kind of lost in that, like, yeah,
throughout that. And I think
that's downplay.
I think also like, I mean, that's a really, we've talked about food so much in true island style, but I'm going to go back to food because I think what you were touching on there is really important as well. Like food in the context of like as a value, you know, like food as a value is really important, definitely for me as a Pacific Islander. And what that looks like often is that in these spaces like Mullabula, where we have gatherings, or like on Imbe where we sit and share Talanoa with other people, like there's always some kind of connection to sharing food, you know, and whether or not that is like food that you've grown and harvested yourself, or, you know, like you bought from the local markets, there is always this understanding that humanizing and dignifying people in the space involves sharing food with them, you know, sharing your story. And what does that look like, you know, for us as Fijians, sharing food in the context of like our diets and like our, as you said, as we were talking about, like the Fijian groups or the images where people share that, and the relationship with that, like how it can be such an important connector for us. Like, what does that look like for us when we return to those, that conversation with our food in these spaces? Like, how can we take elements of, you know, other elements of connecting people that are not obvious, like food, and bring them into these spaces or bring them into these conversations, or, as you said, abstract those ideas and give like a sense of like, this is a space where we gather and we share food and stick and share stories, you know, like what can that look like for us as more of our stories as Fijians and specific people enter these new spaces, these art spaces. And I think definitely in my experience, you know, working with different arts organizations, that's a new language that they're coming to. Like, you can't invite elders along to be part of something without giving them some food, you know, or like Fijian community, like when we did Maramadina, right? And we had that like the Vengia project had that massive community day, and there was a lot of like, what does it look like for us to be in good relationship with each other, but also with Indigenous storytellers of the lands that we're on, be in relationship with food and fruit of the lands. And I love that even though there isn't food in this space right now, I look at the bola bola and I'm like, yeah, I could sit in there and just like have some.
You could eat your lunch in there, yeah.
After this, I'm going to go and eat my lunch by myself in that space.
There's a lot of caring that goes on in a bola, like, discussion, maybe sitting and having some yankona, but also like the preparation of the lovo or all the meals. You know, that's a care, that's a, you know, whether it be a funeral or a wedding or a birthday or, you know, many, like there's different events. You are sitting there, you know, you've got one auntie directing everything, everyone's chatting while they, you know, chop up everything and getting it ready to go. There's a real kind of, you know, and that could be for 100 people, that could be for 400 people, you know, it depends on what kind of event it is. And when I look at the bola, that's what I see, like that care.
I love that. I love that. That's really, but also like what it looks like for care to be, what's the word? Impermanent, right? Because the bola is a structure that is impermanent in the sense that we were talking about how people often rent the like sheets of corrugated tin, put up the poles and like take these like fibrous materials from the coconut and adorn it, and then like these massive celebrations of care that are like really meaningful, you know, whether that's, as you said, like death or birth or marriage, whatever that is, or lotu that happen in these spaces. And then just as quickly as they went up and we felt those like really intense feelings of care and love and generosity in those spaces, it's like taken down and like disappears into everybody's memory. I love.
And that's so true. And also in the moment of preparing for an event like that, it feels like the everyday. Like, I hope that going into the show there is a sense of wonder, but also it still feels like an everyday. But that you're only really going to get that maybe if you understand the relationship of those materials to culture and you've been a part of that culture. Otherwise, just hopefully you get a sense and a feeling.
I definitely think that you can't help but enter this space and have that sense of awe and wonder. Like, it's just so all-encompassing, having like not only with the size of the works and the room, but also just like the way that you're kind of wrapped by these beautiful patterns. And it feels like also like, even though this room is very rectangular, it does feel like there is a sense of like a circular, I keep doing this with my arms, but it feels like there is.
Yeah, the 360 kind of, it's all around. I mean, like, I think that's what installation is supposed to do sonically, but also the elements that sit in a room, like a fully painted room, are supposed to cover you. They are supposed to, in a way, colonize that gallery for that moment and take over all, like, most of your senses. I mean, I know a lot of people would have seen that gallery, and that was also in my mind about why cover every wall. Why make sure that the windows are covered so you can't see, that they're like, you have to really look to see the window there, was to like really just take over the space and make you feel like you're in somewhere, and you're in my kind of a memory, or my kind of feelings. Like, it's even more abstract than that. It's like me trying to work through these ideas of the impacts of colonization on things like climate change, on legacies, and how we perceive the world, and how we shouldn't, like, in a way, we're taught to kind of all perceive it in the same way, but that's not true. As you and I both know, as a lot of people know, we have different kind of experiences and perspectives of the world in relation to, and particularly because of colonization, of power, of dominance.
There's like something in that I just kind of want to extend, and which you've kind of touched on earlier, which is like the impact of these discussions on climate change in the context of like your works, and like the way that we're talking about, you know, culture changing, and like us as Fijians and Pacific people being, you know, not new to this idea of migration. Like, how do you, as an artist, as a human, kind of like grapple with this idea of like wanting to yield to change and accepting change, particularly now, you know, like in the middle of the pandemic, and not really knowing, as we said before, like where we're heading to, and when, if this will end, but also like knowing that like change in the context of like being in a climate emergency is kind of like, is devastating, you know, for us. Like, how do you even have that conversation?
It's like potentially the hardest question. Maybe if we look at the show, not well. I do not deal with it well. Like, you know, some of that, it's kind of agonizing, because we're also like really drawn into a kind of a lifestyle that almost fights against, you know, like recognizing that the climate is changing. But because I guess we come from the Pacific Islands, and the exact experience of that climate change affects everyday life for the people we know, especially like you guys being down on the water's edge, wearing the mangroves. You know, there's so many things that happen that relate to climate change, elements of progress like building roads and, you know, taking electricity to places. And, you know, it's really hard to kind of be too, for me to be kind of too judgmental on other people, especially people in like my own, like, you know, in the islands, say, who have to deal with seeing that change right away, in their exact environment, that every, you know, things aren't as available as they were like in the natural world that are a part of survival. So then you rely on buying things from markets, or, you know, you build the house a little bit higher because the water levels are higher, or I don't the thing is, it is kind of living here in Australia, I don't have to respond to it in the same way. But I think now more than ever, it's on my mind about, what impact are we making, and what choices can I make in my everyday and for myself as an artist in trying to be thoughtful about my environment, especially because when we look at Indigenous technologies, and for us at Fijian, Indigenous technologies, a lot of them just really worked with the land, with the seasons. It wasn't really about creating waste. It was so hard to kind of make everything that you needed to survive, or find or hunt for things that you needed, that you used everything, till you could not use anymore. And I feel like, I try to put some of those methodologies into my practice. Yeah, but that is such a big question, Emele. So how do you respond to that?
Respond to it? Yeah, I'm sorry, I've dumped the biggest question on you last, but how do I respond to it? I think what you said about not having to respond to it in the same way is definitely something that I really struggle with. And I find that the deeper that I come into relationship with the land that I'm on, I'm based on Binjara land, so I'm about an hour south. That has to be my access point for how I engage with the conversation back home, because that's literally the country that I have to care for, where I live. And so that's there's I guess orbs I feel are circling me, where I constantly have to negotiate learning about the seasons of Noongar country, and what those seasonal changes look like, and what it looks like to grow native plants and vegetation, and as we spoke about food before, as a way to kind of support the local climate, but also return to a seasonal diet, and think of and engage more critically and consciously, but also in an embodied way with food sovereignty. But then also these other two orbs of Tokelauan culture and Fijian culture, and learning about what that looks like back home, through a screen, or through an archive, through a book, through a magazine. There's a constant cognitive dissonance, because I have this embodied experience of country, and try to be the best, relation that I can here. And I have this intellectual connection and embodied connection to some extent, because of my genealogy, to what life is back home, and what cosmological knowledge is and what land and sea knowledge is but it feels there is a constant craving that exists, and the craving is never satisfied, and it doesn't matter how much knowledge I seek, or how much art I make, or conversations I have. I'll never feel like I'm doing enough or responding urgently enough. And so I just kind of have to give into that and just accept that, but also try to have the energy to hold the systems and the institutions that are responsible accountable. It's that weird thing of I, as an individual, what I do matters, but also I'm not responsible. Systems and hierarchies are responsible. Going in between those two is what I always wrestle with, and get exhausted with, and overwhelmed with, and then fall in love with, and then hate it again. So yeah, it's.
I feel we're back where we started, and that is, it's quite open-ended, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, but also looking at my child, being born in the middle of a pandemic, and like haven't had the chance to like go home yet, but knowing that he's very literally the embodiment of like whatever I do in terms of like inheriting what the pathways that I set up. It makes it a bit easier to not feel so overwhelmed, you know, because there's like a little day to day that I have to like focus on, and just like doing the best that I can to make sure that that person can make decisions, you know, that are, you know, good decisions, you know, wholesome decisions as much as they can. But it does sometimes, when you're like me, just like stuck by yourself, overthinking everything, it gets too much, right? You just have to focus on little things.
Yeah. It can get overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we kind of spoke about before, like just reminding ourselves to extend, I think, care, how you were talking about care in terms of like finding those spaces like Mbola where we can extend care and grace, you know, not just to others, but to ourselves. Even more so right now, I think is really, really important. And stepping to any conversations around what you bring up in this work, this amazing body of work, like around color, around environmental racism, around, you know, archives and memory, like with a little bit of like compassion and generosity is like, I think, like an exciting way to move forward, but also I feel like the only way that we can move forward, right? I don't know, some people might disagree with me. I feel like that's how I have to step to these spaces, because if you don't, like, it'll just gnaw and tear away at you bit by bit. So I
mean, I think care for others. To care for others, you have to care for yourself, which means you have to combat that. Sorry, you keep going, but I just, you know, I think that's true. Like, it can eat away at you. Something like a comment like, I don't see color, can gnaw at you. But I think the way that helped me deal with that as a comment was to build a whole show around it.
I love that. And as you said, and now what you've done is you've created this portal for other people to have those conversations for themselves and to like extend that journey of healing, which is really important and really beautiful. So Vinaka level Salote, thank you again for sharing, and I really hope that everyone, every single person in Perth will have an opportunity to come and see your show. But yeah, Vinaka.
Thank you, Emele.